You tend to like those seats toward the back, and today I'm going to do the same. I'm leaving early. I'm on my way to Seattle for some meetings over there, but I just want to, I wanted to be here because of this gentleman right here, who I was telling you, one of the ladies out front earlier, I've known him, I remember him since he was a graduate student at the University of Washington, Yoram Bauman. And by the way, I'm Bud Barnes, so for those of you who I've not met. But I remember Yoram, I was at a meeting in Seattle. Oh gosh, Yoram, it's got to go back. When were you a graduate student? 20 years ago?
Yeah, at least.
About 20 years ago. And,
thanks, Bud.
Well, I'll go 40 on you, okay? Anyway, and this young guy got up, and it was an economics conference, and he was giving an overview of some research he had been working on, and I was absolutely mesmerized by his insightfulness and the way in which he was able to fold the theory into what he was really doing and getting a hand on it. And so the conference is over, and I leave and come back, and now fast forward X years, and Ryan Herzog, who's one of our newer economists, came over to me several weeks after, probably it's been a couple of years now, ago, and he said, have you followed Yoram Bauman at all? And I said, no. I said, I really lost touch. And he said, well, he's really caught fire. And he starts talking about some of the things that Yoram is doing, and I won't steal any of his thunder. But what he did say was, he said, he'll come, I think, if you invite him, and he'll do a symposium for us. And he did. And we had a packed house down in McCarthy, and it was an outstanding program he put on. So about 3 months ago, Ryan and I were talking, and he said, I think there's a good chance if we want to, we can bring Yoram back for a breakfast. And so with that, we made the contact, and we're glad to have you back. And I'm going to reserve any more discussions of Dr. Bauman until Ryan Herzog, Professor Herzog, introduces him. I want to take just this opportunity as we close out the calendar year and introduce some of the board members who are here on this, that really are responsible for bringing these symposium speakers. And in the past, we've had our auction, as some of you have attended, and just all the wonderful things they've done. And I can't tell you how many hundreds of thousands of dollars we have raised for scholarships from the work of this board. And I'm forever in their debt for what they have done to help lift the School of Business here at Gonzaga University. And so if I might, just for a moment, as I scan the room, I see Mary Dunn. Mary is here. Mary, thank you for all the good things you do. Brad Pope, Dr. Brad Pope from Group Health is here, one of our board members. And who am I missing? Lowell Ruin. Lowell, well, just outstanding service to support the programs here at Gonzaga. And just the untold number of young men and women. I've always held, since I was probably as young as Yoram, that there is no greater benefit from benefaction, none, in my opinion, from benefaction, giving to others, than giving to education. Because it's those young minds that go on out and they go do great things. They give back to their communities, they work hard, they're productive, they create innovative things that most of us my age, have never dreamed before. But it's because of that foundation of life at home and education that pushes them forward. And everything I feel that we can do here at Gonzaga to help stimulate that, to give those young men and women those opportunities to really go out and do great work is what it's all about for those of us in education. And I admire and I respect all of the other charitable work that goes on in our communities. I think it's a wonderful thing that occurs when we all have an opportunity to step out and support some of these wonderful, wonderful charities that do so much great work. in helping others. But when it comes to the future of this great country, I personally believe it is through education that the solution can be found. So, with no further ado, I apologize. I have to slip away early. I just want to say to all of you, it's been a great ride for me. This will be, I think, my last opportunity to stand before you as the Dean of the Business School. And as of January 1st, we'll have an interim dean. Ken Anderson will be here, and he'll do a great job. But I've really enjoyed the ride. And as I close my comments, I just want to say I wish everyone in this room the best of holidays and the best of a great coming 2014. At this time, let me introduce Ryan Herzog to introduce our guest speaker.
Yesterday he calls me into his office and says, okay, I'm going to be in a hurry tomorrow morning. I'm going to do a real short introduction. So I guess for us that know Bud, that might have been his short introduction. It's my pleasure. I've known Yoram now for 4 years. I've followed his YouTube clips. He's pretty much traveled all around the world giving this show. He is here as part of Carbon Washington. He's been passionate about environmental economics all the way back from his graduate days. He did his PhD. He's not 20 years ago. He graduated back in 2003 from University of Washington. Went out and taught for a couple years at Whitman, which drove him to doing stand-up comedy. Living in Walla Walla for a year, like that apparently. Since then, he's kind of traveled all around the world, being a guest lecturer, giving his comedy talks, and so he is here as part of Carbon Washington, wanting to get support for a what we call revenue-neutral tax shift of a carbon bill. So I'm going to give it to him, give him the time. He's much more funnier than I am, but Yoram Bauman.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. I'm going to use the mic because I have an editorial board meeting with the Spokesman Review after this, and I need to save my voice. That was an iffy joke, I guess, first thing in the morning. I thought it was funny. I do appear before you this morning, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's first and only stand-up economist. Thank you. Thank you. You're not awake. Okay. I really only have one thing going for me as a stand-up economist, and that's low expectations. Actually, that's not true. I have one other thing going for me as a stand-up economist. I get to make fun of macroeconomists. You know that I'm a real economist because I can poke fun at subdisciplines that are totally indistinguishable to people on the outside. You know, people in Washington make fun of people in Oregon, and people in Alabama make fun of people in Mississippi, and people in prison make fun of people in graduate school. I did go through 5 years of graduate school. I got my PhD in economics, only to decide that I wanted to do stand-up comedy. Yes, thank you, sir. You can imagine how much this thrilled my father. He told me I'd never make it as a stand-up economist, and I said, why not? And he said, because there's no demand. We're going to have a good time this morning. Are you awake yet? Working on it. I said, don't worry, Dad, I'm a supply-side economist. The crowd is turning on me. I just stand up and let the jokes trickle down. You know, people say that economics and stand-up comedy don't have very much in common, but that's totally not true. In both cases, nobody sits in the front row. And I want to thank you. I think you have set a new record here for like the number of rows in the front that are empty. So actually, as someone who has been a faculty member, that actually makes me feel very comfortable, like to see these empty seats up front and then lots of people in the back. All you need to do is like pop open your laptops and take your phones out and start tapping away, and then I'll be like, yeah. Before I go any further, I should show you my t-shirt. It's my, this is my, it's good. Approve of capitalism? Good. My Enjoy Capitalism t-shirt, made in China. If you look at the tag on the back, it's actually 80% cotton and 20% irony. Since this is a business school crowd, I should mention that sometimes people want to know where they can buy these t-shirts, and I refuse to tell them. I'll explain why, because I got it from a place on the internet, and I emailed these people and said, look, I have this website, standupeconomist.com. It gets a fair amount of traffic from folks who might be interested in buying your t-shirt. Why don't we set up a deal where I advertise the t-shirt, you give me a cut of the revenue? Right? They said that they weren't interested. From which I can only conclude that they love capitalism. They're just not very good at it. I lived in China in 2011. I lived there for 5 months. I want to show you the place where I lived in China. I'm going to dim the lights just for 1 second here. I lived in a housing complex in Beijing that houses 400,000 people. And I was, this is the view from my apartment window. I was one of 2 non-Chinese people who lived there. It was me and the guy that everybody there referred to as the black guy. And then one day I was walking down the street to the bus stop and I saw a black guy. And I kind of lost my sense of propriety, right? Like I stared at him and I walked up to him and I pointed at him and I said, you must be the, but before I could get the words out, he pointed at me. And he said, you must be the white guy. Sure enough, I was the white guy, he was the black guy. And then there were 399,998 Chinese people. Anyway, he was from Ghana. He was there on a scholarship. Super nice guy. We went to McDonald's. We had lunch. International sign of friendship. So anyway, this is a view from my apartment window. About 5% of the time it looked like this. Much more often the view from my apartment window looked like that. Yeah, so pretty serious pollution problems in China. Everybody in China knows that China owns, $3 trillion in U.S. government debt. They don't necessarily understand what that means. I had one fellow there who insisted to me, he was really mad. He said, America is a loan shark. And I was like, that is exactly backwards, right? Like America's not a loan shark. America's like a borrowing walrus. We're just like floating in a sea of our own treasury debt. And this guy in China was like, don't talk to me about that treasury debt. It's lousy. And here in China, we're pissed off that you sold us that treasury debt. And I said, that's kind of interesting because in America, we're pissed off that you bought it. Now, I just like to point out that this is the opposite of the way that economics is supposed to work. Right? You're supposed to get mutual benefits from trade and to end up in a situation where you have voluntary transactions between 2 parties and both of them are unhappy. That actually takes a considerable amount of effort, right? Anyway, I apologized to the fellow in China. I said I was sorry on behalf of, my entire country. And I said if I could go back in time, I would encourage China to invest that money somewhere else, like Greece. Anyway, so this next little routine I'm going to do for you actually stems a bit from my time in China. It's about the economics of the afterworld, which is a new topic in economics research. And so this is a routine that's called hyperinflation in hell. More generically, hyperinflation in the afterworld. Let's talk about hyperinflation on Earth. This is something that is familiar to most folks, like Germany in between the world wars, Zimbabwe, 5 years ago had this massive bout of hyperinflation. This is the $100 trillion Zimbabwe note, which you can buy on eBay for about 25 cents. Now, the economy of the afterworld is actually kind of a new topic for economic research. And actually, the conventional wisdom is that the economy of the afterworld is extremely stable. For instance, there's no evidence that there are central bankers in the afterworld. If you're laughing at that joke, make sure not to confuse correlation with causation. Anyway, we actually demonstrate to the contrary, my co-author and I, that in fact there's chronic hyperinflation in the afterworld, and that it's driven by the same thing that drives hyperinflation here on Earth, namely a massive increase in the money supply, which I'm going to call M4. What is driving this increase in the money supply? It's Joss paper. So here are some examples of Joss paper. Joss paper is part of certain Asian religious traditions where you burn fake money and it sends money to your ancestors in the afterworld. So the premise of our paper is, with all this economic growth and population growth in Asia, you have a lot more people buying Joss paper, burning Joss paper. What is this doing to the money supply in the afterworld? Okay. This phenomenon has been exacerbated by a technological development, which I'm going to show you with this video here, which also sort of shows how Joss paper works. So here's the old way to send money to your ancestors in the afterworld. All right, you take the Joss paper, you burn it. It goes to your ancestors in the afterworld. Now here's the new way to send money to your ancestors in the afterworld. This is the Hell Banknote app for the iPhone, which has been downloaded 10,000 times, including by me. And so this is actually the dematerialization of dematerialization. And in a really interesting twist, not only can you burn fake money with this iPhone app, you can actually burn fake goods, including iPhones, which presumably have the iPhone app on them. In any case, so if we do the theory real quick, the theory is very simple, right? It sounds terrific that everybody kind of gets to be a central banker. Everybody can print money for the economy of the afterworld. But if you sort of think about it for a minute, it's clearly not as great as it sounds, right? You end up with a tragedy of the commons situation where each individual is going to print an amount of money that vastly exceeds the social optimum. So if you think about, I mean, what would the situation in the United States be like if everybody could print $100 bills? Right, instead of just the US Treasury and the North Koreans. But what about empirical evidence? Now you might think it's difficult to do empirical work on the afterworld. That's actually not true. Well, it is true, but we found a way around it. It's through the theory that economists call, well, it's part of arbitrage, it's actually rational expectations. Right? But the idea is that, well, if you have the same good or similar goods that are selling on two different stock markets, for example, then they should trade at about the same price. Right, two different stocks should trade about the same price, otherwise people will buy low and sell high. So we can actually do this sort of intertemporal, interspatial kind of arbitrage. And I'm going to give you this example here. These three pieces of Joss paper, $1 million, £1,000,000, and 500 euros, all purchased by me in Beijing for the same amount of money here on Earth. Now if you think about arbitrage or more generally rational expectations, right, if I'm an optimizing sort of rational individual, there's no reason why I would buy the one that had the lower value in the afterworld. And so we can sort of expect that all three of these pieces of Joss paper should have the same value in the afterworld. In other words, the value of $1 million in the afterworld should be equal to the value of £1,000,000, which should be equal to the value of 500 euro. Okay. Now the strength of the euro in the afterworld may surprise you. But I'm going to come back to that. Now, none of this tells us what any of these three pieces of currency are actually worth. That's where this next piece of evidence comes from. These three bills, $50, $100, $1,000 Joss paper notes, all purchased by me in Beijing for the same amount of money here on Earth. They should be worth the same amount of money in the afterworld. So we are now looking for the variable x that solves the equation 50x equals 100x equals 1,000x. Now, I know it's early in the morning, so I'm going to push the details into the mathematical appendix and cut to the chase, which is that x has got to be equal to 0. Okay. In other words, we have empirical evidence that there's been a massive devaluation of the currency in the afterworld. This also incidentally explains the supposed strength of the euro. Right? It goes away when you multiply by 0. Now this leads to our policy recommendations. We think that there is a tremendous and pressing need for necroeconomic reform. Well, because if we don't do any necroeconomic reform, then bad things are going to happen to non-living standards. And you know how to measure non-living standards, right? With GDP per d capita. But thanks, I'll be here all morning. So there are kind of three levels of necroeconomic reform. Level one is the faithful should learn some economics. Right, level two, if that doesn't work, is the Fed could just take over the underworld. They already have kind of a swollen balance sheet. They could swell it a little bit more. And level three, if that doesn't work, is dollarization. In other words, we could ban Joss paper and just require people who want to send money to their ancestors in the afterworld to burn actual currency, right? Which we are confident would solve the problem of hyperinflation in the afterworld as effectively as it has in places like Zimbabwe and Ecuador that now use the US dollar as their currency. I have a brief epilogue to this. So I am the editor of an economics journal, but I'm the editor for the miscellany section, which is actually a section of economics humor. Thank you. So the journal is called Economic Inquiry. It's a real economics journal. Every quarter we try to publish a funny paper, and I'm in charge of that section of the journal. So my co-author and I wanted to submit our paper to this journal, and I made the mistake. What I should have done was just said, okay, I'm the editor of this section. I think the paper is funny, so we're going to publish it. What I actually did was recuse myself from the process and ask the executive editor of the journal to shepherd the paper through the referee process. That ended badly, but I got some jokes along the way, so I want to share with you what happened. So we submitted it in 2012. The editor sent it out for 2 referees. Referee number 1 wrote back something that was sort of a backhanded compliment, but at least made sense. They said, the paper's funny as long as you are constrained to reading economics articles. Thank you. Referee number 2 wrote something that was a lot more strange. Referee number 2 wrote that the paper is entertaining in the sense the stand-up comedy routine is entertaining. I'm pretty sure a stand-up comedy routine is supposed to be pretty entertaining, right? In any case, the paper ended up being rejected because of concerns from the referees. So I'd like to share with you the referee concerns. Referee number 1 wrote that the paper lacks a dynamic post-mortem general equilibrium model, and consequently was not worthy of publication. Referee number 2 was even more interesting. Referee number 2 wrote, the paper makes the mistaken assumption that there is no technological progress in the afterlife. Why would the dead suddenly lose their capacity to innovate? Maybe it's because they're dead. Referee number 2 also added a postscript, P.S. Where is the promised mathematical appendix? At least I got some good jokes out of it. Let's see, the next little bit that I want to do for you, it hasn't been long since they announced the winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics. So this little bit is called What to Expect When You're Expecting the Nobel Prize. So if you're expecting the Nobel Prize in Economics, and I hope there are folks here who are thinking in that direction, here's what to expect. You should expect an early morning phone call from a long-dead economist. So when you get the Nobel Prize, they give you a phone call that comes at kind of a reasonable hour Sweden time. But it's 6 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast, 3 o'clock in the morning on the West Coast. They tell you that you won the Nobel Prize, and then they call you back and do a phone interview and post the transcript online for everybody to see. So here's the interview with Edmund Phelps from 2006. And the interview is conducted by the editor-in-chief of the Nobel Prize website, whose name is, well, you'll see in a moment what his name is. So here's the interview. Hello, may I speak to Professor Phelps, please? And he says, who's calling? And the guy says, I'm calling from the Nobel Foundation, and my name is Adam Smith. Edmund Phelps just starts cracking up, right? Here's this phone call at 3 in the morning from Adam Smith telling him that he won the Nobel Prize. And Adam Smith says, I know it could be a hoax call with a name like that. It's a terrible burden I carry. I think that Us magazine should start running a little segment called Nobel Prize Winners. They're just like us. So here's another example from the interview with Leonid Hurwitz and his wife Evelyn. So Leonid Hurwitz was the oldest person to win the Nobel Prize in any discipline, not just economics. So here's the interview with him and his wife from 2007. Adam Smith calls up and says, good morning, Professor Hurwitz. And he's like, hello? And his wife says he's hard of hearing. So Adam Smith says, I'm sorry, I'll speak louder. Can you hear me now? And his wife says yes. And then, thank you, my name is Adam Smith, and ha ha ha, they all start laughing again. I've got a couple of cartoon economics books, Micro and Macro. I actually have some copies here if anybody's interested in purchasing them. I'll sell them I actually sell them at $10 a piece. That's pretty much my cost. It's less than you can buy them on Amazon for, which is kind of amazing. I will admit that I lose money on every unit that I sell, but I make up for it with volume, which I think is also something that Amazon does, and it worked for them. So I think I just have to issue stock and I'll become rich. There's a line that I really like by Matthew Iglesias, a blogger, who says that Amazon.com is a charity run for the benefit of consumers and funded by investors. I bring this up, well, I want to mention a couple things. One is that my co-author and I are actually working on a cartoon book about climate change now, so that's going to be our next project. It's coming out in May or June, so keep an eye out for that. And one of the things we do in the book is we try to sort of explain what people won the Nobel Prize for in kind of fun and quick ways. So like here's Jim Tobin saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And the King of Sweden says, congratulations, you win the Nobel Prize. And if you go back, Tobin died about 10 or 15 years ago. He was at Yale. This is actually in his obituary, his New York Times obituary. When he went to get the Nobel Prize, the reporters were like, tell us about, portfolio selection theory, one of his theories. And he started talking about, alpha and beta and doing math and stuff like this. And the reporter said, no, that's too complicated, make it simple. And so Tobin said, well, it's kind of like don't put all your eggs in one basket. And then the next day, headlines around the world said, economist wins Nobel Prize for don't put all your eggs in one basket. So this one's actually true. The other ones we just kind of made up. So here's Gary Becker saying sometimes crime does pay. So Becker's at the University of Chicago, and he won for applying economic ways of thinking to issues that we don't necessarily think about as being economics, like crime and drug addiction and family dynamics. John Nash has figured out the optimal strategy for rock, paper, scissors. So if you've seen the book or read the movie A Beautiful Mind, that's about John Nash. Super interesting character. George Agerlof says buying an individual health insurance policy can be a real pain in the neck. So if you're interested or paying attention to stuff about Obamacare, like the individual mandates, stuff like that, a lot of it goes back to the Market for Lemons paper that George Agerlof wrote. I'm not going to get sidetracked into talking about Obamacare, but I will give you my 2-second version of it, which is that it's kind of this, it's a battle between market failure and government failure. And that's a hard place to be. George Agerlof also, fun fact about George Agerlof, he is married to Janet Yellen, who's been nominated to be the head of the Fed. So, economics power couple. Yeah. I also saw him on an airplane once, going to the American Economic Association meeting. He was riding coach, which was kind of cool. My godmother was on the plane also. I run the humor session every year at the Economic Association meeting, and my family sometimes comes out to join me. And so when I got off the plane, I told my godmother, because I recognized a bunch of economists on the plane, including Akerlof. I got off the plane and I said, Betty, I said, there were a lot of economists on that plane. And she said, yes, I know. And I said, how did you know there were a bunch of economists on the plane? And she said, well, they all seemed like they were kind of mixed up. Here's a Joseph Stiglitz saying sometimes the invisible hand is invisible because it's not there, which is actually a classic Stiglitz line. Daniel Kahneman says human beings are not always rational, and King of Sweden is like, wow, really? So Kahneman is the psychologist at Princeton who won the Nobel Prize in economics for sort of laying the foundations of what we now call behavioral economics, sort of looking at to what extent do people actually behave the way that rational economic models say that they do. Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize a couple years ago. She says there's more than one way to scale a fish. So she studied tragedy of the commons situations, especially fisheries around the world, and studied the extent to which local communities could address those problems. And then someday, somebody, my guess is Marty Weitzman at Harvard, is going to win for the idea that the way to get people to pollute less is to make polluting expensive. So he did early work on this topic going back to the 70s on what we would now call sort of the first comparison of carbon taxes and cap and trade systems. And he continues to do really good work in this area today. This is actually the area that when I do serious economics work, I work on environmental economics and climate change and carbon taxes and things like that. So I'm going to be serious for a couple minutes, and then we'll see if there's any Q&A, and if we have time, I'll tell a couple more jokes. So that's kind of the plan for the rest of the morning here. So I do a lot of, I think I'll be fair and say I do a lot of audiences that are more conservative than this audience. So like Florida Bankers Association, Barry Goldwater Institute, trucking executives on the banks of the Arkansas River. That was a story. So I'm going to give you the same sort of spiel that I give to them, which starts with this. So everything you need to know about climate change in just a couple of slides. First of all, we have this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody really doubts this. Nobody doubts this is caused primarily by human activity, principally burning fossil fuels, but also deforestation. Okay, then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually predates Al Gore. They laughed more at that joke at the Barry Goldwater Institute. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden, and in 1896 he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden. And we tend to be a little more worried about changing the basic functionings of planet Earth. In any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years, and here are the results of the experiment. Going back to the 1880s, the red bars are 10-year average temperatures, going up through the 1970s, and then there's the 1980s, there's the 1990s, there's the 2000s. For what it's worth, there's the first few years of this decade. Temperatures going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. You may have seen news stories that said there's been quote unquote no global warming for the last 10 or 15 years, which is basically true, right? You can see it from the data, but you have to look at that in the context of, multi-decadal increases in temperatures. In any case, if you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which, like I said, is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation and the development of new technologies and all the things that I at least love about capitalism. Capitalism. So what I work on as an environmental economist is sort of using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. Okay, a couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, but the point of those policies is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. This is generally the part in my talks where people stop laughing, because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and things like this. But there is a side benefit to these policies, other than like the main benefit of potentially saving the world. And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. Government can do all sorts of stuff with that revenue. You all, I'm sure, have your own ideas about what the government can do with a pile of revenue, but the idea that I work on and talk to folks about is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So what's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting or revenue neutral tax swaps. Right, the idea being that we should have higher taxes on things we want less of, like pollution, and then we can afford to have lower taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income and savings and investment. And this is where I find common ground even with folks like George Will. So George Will, pretty conservative columnist for the Washington Post. He came to one of my classes a few years ago. He doesn't believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, but I asked him if he would support replacing part of the payroll tax, part of the employment tax in this country with the carbon tax, and he said that he was all for it because he hates the payroll tax. And with unemployment at 8%, I hate the payroll tax. Right? And Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. In any case, kind of economists across the political spectrum think this is a good idea, and there's even a place that's done this. So to our north, the Canadian province of British Columbia has what many economists consider to be the best climate policy in the world, implemented by a right-of-center government. They said, we want to do something about climate change. We don't want to grow government. We want to be business-friendly. They implemented a 100% revenue-neutral carbon tax. Carbon tax is $30 per ton of CO2. So that's the equivalent of about 30 cents a gallon of gasoline, 3 cents an hour of coal-fired power, 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour of natural gas power, 15 cents a therm. Right? So I'm not trying to sell you a free lunch, but I'm trying to sell you value for money. Okay? Because if you look at what they did in British Columbia with the $5 billion they raised over 6 or 7 years, they used that money to reduce personal and corporate income taxes. BC now has the lowest personal income taxes in Canada. They have the lowest corporate income taxes in the G8 group of rich democracies. There's an offset for low-income households. Really a terrific policy. It's been in place now since 2008, so we can actually see how it's working. So first of all, let's take a look at economic growth. In BC is in green, all of Canada is in blue. So BC is outperforming Canada as a whole. There's certainly no evidence that the carbon tax has hurt BC, and there are actually some studies that suggest that the carbon tax is helping the economy in BC, essentially because the carbon tax is less of a drag on the economy than the personal and corporate income taxes that it's replacing. We can also look at fossil fuel consumption. Here's motor gasoline. Again, BC is in green, Canada is in blue. The drop at the beginning is because of the financial crisis. But my title for this slide is Economics Works. Like when you make something more expensive, people buy less of it. And so carbon emissions in BC have fallen by about 10%, which is really terrific. It's a terrific accomplishment. So I'm working with this group, as Ryan mentioned, Carbon Washington, to bring something similar to Washington State. I want to tell you how we could do that in Washington State. We don't have an income tax in Washington State, so we looked at another broad-based tax that we could reduce, and we ended up with the sales tax. Right, so here's what I want to try to pitch to you this morning. We can cut the state sales tax by a full percentage point. That's going to save the average household in Washington state hundreds of dollars a year. Right, nickels and dimes add up over time. This is going to save taxpayers overall $1.2 billion a year in the state of Washington. So that's going to help. The sales tax is regressive. Carbon taxes are kind of regressive. So reducing the sales tax is one way to help deal with the regressivity. We're also going to deal with the regressivity by funding the working families rebate, which is an earned income tax credit policy. I'm happy to talk more about that if people have questions. And what about businesses? So they're kind of the sectors of the business community that we think are going to be relatively strongly affected by a carbon tax: manufacturers, agriculture, small businesses. And so what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate the B&O tax for manufacturers. Right. So this is going to cost the manufacturers currently pay about $150, $200 million a year in B&O taxes. Our estimate of their carbon tax liabilities is less than that. So in aggregate, we think this is actually going to benefit manufacturers, and we've done some case studies with manufacturers and who have been willing to share their proprietary B&O tax liabilities with us, and they've come out ahead. We'd love to do more of those. So if anybody here is connected with manufacturing interest, would love to connect with you and talk about that. We're going to triple the small business B&O tax credit. That's going to benefit small businesses about $100 million a year. So and I mentioned agriculture. We're actually going to exempt farm diesel from the carbon tax for reasons that I would be happy to go into later. But that's kind of the one exemption that we're providing. So all this is about $1.2 billion a year. The working families rebate about $200 million a year. The B&O tax credit elimination for manufacturers about $200 million. Small business B&O tax credit about $100 million. Add all that up, you get $1.7 billion a year. Where are we going to get $1.7 billion a year? We're going to get it from a BC-style carbon tax. So we're going to start actually lower than BC. BC's at 30. We'll start at 25, phase it in over a couple of years, raise it. So the idea is to maintain revenue neutrality. Okay, so sales tax revenues are going to grow roughly with the size of the economy, with inflation and stuff like that. So we need to increase the carbon tax, at a slow rate, so nominal GDP plus 1%, so a few percentage points a year. So by 2020, we'll be at the level of $30 per ton of CO2 that BC has had since 2012. So we think this is a pretty cool policy. That's the group I'm involved with. It's called Carbon Washington. carbonwa.org is our website. Our goal is to put this on the ballot next year in Washington State, to run a ballot measure in Washington State for November of 2014. So that's part of why I'm kind of traveling around talking about it and things like that. And one of the reasons why I'm here is to get feedback and comments and ideas from you all about it. I want to do one last thing, which is sort of give you a little bit of an international perspective. And the international perspective is sort of my pitch on, I don't know, why climate change is important, or why it's a potential risk is maybe a better way of saying it. And this comes back to something that I call the 5 Chinas theory of the world. And the 5 Chinas theory of the world is that you can take the world population, which is 7 billion people, right? You divide by 5, you get 1.4, which is approximately the population of China. So you can divide the world into 5 chunks that are the size of China, right? And here they are. There's China. India has about as many people as China. Add up everybody else in Asia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the Philippines, Vietnam, add them all up, about as many people as China. Right? The OECD is essentially the rich world. So North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, a few other random countries, add them all up, about the same population as China. And then everybody else is principally Africa and South America. So the story I told at the beginning of the white guy and the black guy and sort of 3 Asian people, that's actually kind of the way the world is in aggregate. If you look at, so over the course of this century, we're going to be adding 2 and perhaps 3 more Chinas to the planet. Okay, but what's really driving carbon emissions and global warming concerns is not so much population growth as it is economic growth. There's a lot of very positive aspects to that, right? A lot of people around the world, I think, are coming out of poverty, getting access to transportation and electricity and education and healthcare and things that we take for granted. I think that's going to be one of the big stories of this century, right? Is all those folks coming out of poverty. I think the other big story this century is dealing with some of the environmental impacts of having 7 billion or growing to 10 or 11 billion people who are all trying to have the same lifestyle that we have. And to get you a sense of that, if you take these 5 Chinas, here's what per capita carbon emissions look like in those 5 Chinas. Right, so at the beginning of this century, the rich world was responsible for about half of world CO2 emissions. Okay. China, you can see, is sort of catching up. it was in 2006 or 2007 that China passed the United States for the first time as being the #1 source of CO2 in the world. Right, so that was 6 or 7 years ago. In a year or two, China will be at double US levels. Right, and even at double US levels, China has 4 times more people than we do. So they're still at half our level per capita. Right, so I'm not going to stand here and tell you that climate change is like a looming catastrophe, because I actually think academically, it is an interesting question about how bad business as usual would be. What I am going to tell you is that if it turns out to be a problem, then changing it is going to be hard, right, in the international context, very hard. Why don't I stop there and see if there are any questions, and then I can tell some more jokes at the end maybe. But thank you all for listening and things like this. Yes, sir.
You said you intend to run this as a 2014 ballot measure, I assume an initiative?
Yeah.
Is that because we don't think the legislature could implement it correctly?
Yeah. I also think, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think that, I guess I feel like I blame kind of both parties for that. Like, I think that there are a lot of Republicans who aren't all that interested in doing stuff about climate change. And there are a lot of folks on the left, including I think the governor, who are a lot more interested in kind of more, what I would consider to be more heavy-handed kind of regulatory kind of approaches, or cap and trade systems that are more complicated, that sort of generate revenue for green investments that the government's involved in. And I think that this is kind of a clean, simple, kind of potentially bipartisan kind of approach. And the risk of being bipartisan is that you kind of lose everybody, right? Yes, sir.
Your potential 2014 initiative. You can't factor that in, but I hope you have, because you're smart people, that you have thought through the amount of money the oil industry would bring in, would be a cash cow for newspapers, TV, radio stations, etc.
In terms of advertising?
Yeah, advertising.
You're telling me that it's not going to be easy.
I'm telling you, it's going to be damn near impossible.
Yeah, it's going to be hard.
Because I'm willing to bet Chevron would have more money to spend on this than you will.
That's definitely true. I do think so. I think that with some folks in the business community, potentially with the oil companies as well, there's an interesting dynamic in play where if you're going to have a climate policy, I think they tend to support something like this. And like the CEO of BP has sort of said that he supports a carbon tax kind of nationally. That doesn't mean that he supports a carbon tax state level or that he's behind any particular piece of carbon tax legislation. But I think if you talk to business leaders, including folks in the petroleum industry or the fossil fuel industry, they sort of say, look, if you're going to have this, we'd rather have the certainty that comes with having a carbon tax, as opposed to the heavy-handed regulations, as opposed to like a complicated cap and trade system. And so I think part of the challenge is, and I think there's some potential here, and we're we're working on having conversations with some of those folks. The potential is to say, look, if something is happening, do you want to have a low carbon fuel standard? Do you want to have a California style cap and trade system? Or do you want to sort of have something like this? And I think that there's a lot of energy right now in Washington and Oregon, which are in between BC, which has this carbon tax system, California, which has what I consider to be kind of less good and more complicated cap and trade system. There's a lot of energy in Washington and Oregon to sort of join forces with move in one direction or the other. And we're part of we're kind of pushing for the BC approach, but you're absolutely right that it's not going to be easy. Yes, sir.
Where in the supply chain is the tax collected?
Where's the tax collected? We're trying to follow BC, and you basically do it kind of upstream. So you try to do it as far towards the entry point into the economy as possible. So at the refinery gate, first import, first sale in the state, things like that. The carbon tax is also going to be extended to the carbon content of imported electricity. And so you can do that through fuel mix disclosure forms and things like that. Is there a question in the back? Yes?
I'm kind of piggybacking on the earlier question, but since you mentioned specifically Washington and Oregon being sandwiched between California and BC, are you aiming to introduce initiatives in both states which would help divert some of the oil petroleum industry function, or I should say focus as far as dumping money into our initiative process? Or where are you planning on going with this?
There are folks in Oregon who are talking about this. So both legislatures in Oregon and Washington have passed study bills. I think that it's more likely that Oregon is sort of on a little bit of a slower track. So potentially aiming for 2016 or something like that. I think it's unlikely that they'll do anything in 2014. So that's where things stand. But if you're interested in things in Oregon, there was a terrific report that was put out by a group that's called NERC. I don't even know what that stands for. It's at Portland State University. It's a report that's called Carbon Tax and Shift. And Oregon does have an income tax, and so they can do something basically exactly like what British Columbia did, where they have a carbon tax, they reduce income taxes, and the state legislature has funded this group, NERC, at Portland State University, which is headed by Tom Potowski, who was formerly the state economist, to do a more detailed analysis of sort of how that would work in Oregon and what it would look like. So lots of interesting movement, I think, in both states. 1, 2, yes, sir.
So as the economic works and usage declines, do you have kind of a projection when it might become revenue negative?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I feel like BC has seen maybe a 10% reduction in carbon emissions, and that's roughly what we would expect in Washington. It's not going to be quick to sort of reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, right? It's going to take decades. So what I'd say is I'm pretty comfortable that we can be pretty close to revenue neutral for a couple of decades. Beyond that, I'm less confident. But beyond that, I mean, we're going to have to make some changes to our tax system anyway. Just to pick an example, transportation funding in this state is a huge problem. And it's a problem basically because people are driving a little bit less and they're driving much more fuel efficient vehicles. And so the gas tax revenue is not keeping up with maintenance needs. And there's $1 billion a year of unfunded maintenance needs in the state. And so, the story I like to tell is that the first jurisdiction to implement a gas tax was actually Oregon, and it was about 100 years ago. Right? So 100 years ago, there were no gas taxes. 100 years ago, there were no cars. Right? And 100 years from now, there will probably not be any gas taxes because, I don't know, we'll be flying around in solar-powered wings or something, right? But so over a multi-decadal period, the tax system is going to have to change. We think that, this amounts for about 10% of the state tax system, and we think that it's a good way to deal with an important problem, and we'll make future changes down the road. Yes.
Are you the kickoff with? You weren't kidding about spokesman review today.
No.
And so
I'm not kidding about anything.
Are you the kickoff for this? Is the initiative starting, or because I know that you've started getting signatures, and then you have to do it within a certain time period.
Yeah, so we file in January.
You file in January.
File in January, we collect signatures until June.
Okay.
If you're interested in getting involved, thank you for asking. That would be terrific. So that's the timeline. So we're sort of finalizing things between now and January, file in January. Signatures are due at the end of June. If we get 300,000 signatures, we end up on the ballot in November. Yes, sir.
George Will's concept was to get rid of something. Why don't you get rid of, say, the estate tax, get rid of the B&O tax, rather than a partial toss of the sales tax? I mean, get rid of maybe some of the payroll tax issues in Washington.
I'd be happy to.
That's where BC went. I mean, they just went big and get rid of stuff, and people will go for it.
They actually didn't. BC still has personal and corporate income taxes. They just have significantly lower rates for those. So you're right. It is attractive to sort of eliminate certain taxes. I'd be happy to chat more about ideas. I'm not. The payroll tax is a national issue, so I don't know what
issues you could get rid of.
Okay, send me an email. Let's talk about it. Sure. Yes, sir. Maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah.
I have actually a couple of questions, kind of similar to each other. One is that we don't have a lot of fossil fuel generated energy here. A lot of our pollution problems are caused by cars. Is that fair?
Transportation more generally, yeah.
Yeah. And then so how do you address that? And then secondly, what is the spectrum of businesses, companies that would be subject to the carbon tax under your proposal?
Okay, so the first question was sort of about where do fossil fuels in Washington State. So you're right that it's mostly transportation, but there actually is we have one coal plant in the state. There's a fair amount of coal, and there's a number of natural gas plants in the state, and there's a fair amount of coal and natural gas electricity that's imported into the state from coal strip from other places in other states. So it's not just transportation. On the transportation front, that's kind of the hardest. That's the hardest thing to tackle, but I think it's a small step in the right direction. Right? And you look at the way people responded when, it wasn't all that long ago, 10 years ago, the gas was like $2 a gallon. Right? There was that little period after it was in like 2002, 2003, right, when gas was really cheap. And then it went up to $4 a gallon, and people stopped buying Hummers and they started buying, Priuses and things like that. So there is responsiveness to those sorts of price changes. And we saw in BC, right, that there was a responsiveness to price changes there. So people actually do change their behavior. And so that's what we'll do, I think. I hope that's a good answer to your question. Your other question, remind me, sorry. I'm sorry?
Who do we tax?
Oh, who do we tax? So the tax will be applied, like what this gentleman was asking about, we try to tax it upstream. So to a large extent, we're kind of trying to layer it on top of existing. So there's an existing gas tax that's paid at the refinery gate. And the carbon tax on petroleum products will be paid in the same place. And then there are a couple of kind of additions that we'll make in terms of refinery operations, in terms of imported electricity, things like that.
So you wouldn't purport to tax all sources of carbon emissions?
We're focusing on taxing fossil fuel carbon emissions. We're not looking at non-fossil sources. We're not looking at other greenhouse gases. We're just looking at CO2 from fossil fuels. Well, why don't we, I'm happy to chat afterwards with anybody who wants to know more. And again, there's our website is carbonwa.org. We'd love to connect with folks and get feedback. And if you're interested in being on our weekly email list or being part of the effort, you should let me know. I'm also happy to sell copies of my cartoon book afterwards if anybody wants that. But now I will go back to telling you jokes. So thank you for putting up with that. Although I did this once for a very conservative crowd in Minnesota, and this fellow came up to me at the end of my talk and said that the stuff I said about climate change was the funniest part of my whole routine. I'll say that it's been a big year for economics comedy. I got to be on the PBS NewsHour. Yeah, thank you. Now, I don't know how much you all know about the world of stand-up comedy, but let me just tell you this. In the world of stand-up comedy, ladies and gentlemen, it does not get any bigger than the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. It was pretty amazing. They interviewed 3 economists on this show. They interviewed Ken Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize. They interviewed Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize. And they interviewed me. I felt like kind of a self-aware version of Sarah Palin. And what did they ask me? My moment of TV fame in the PBS NewsHour, they asked me if I'd ever bombed on stage. Okay, now a couple of things about this. All right, first of all, I am not afraid of failure. I'm an economist. Secondly, I'm a professional comedian, right? So if a joke doesn't work, you just sort of keep throwing stuff out there until you find something that sticks. Which is basically the same thing that the Fed and the Treasury have been doing for the last few years. Finally, I had to admit, well, I'll tell that story another time. I want to share some other recent developments in the world of economics comedy. I told the joke about the right, so I'll tell the joke about the left now. This sign, Obama equals Keynesian, question mark. Keynesian economics, going back to John Maynard Keynes, the idea that you can use like fiscal or monetary policy to get the economy out of a recession. So there was a right-winger who showed up at a left-wing rally in Washington, D.C. with a sign that said Obama equals Keynesian, question mark. And then took videos of all these left-wingers who came up to them, and they were really mad. And they were like, that is ridiculous. His birth certificate is on file in Hawaii. He's not Kenyan. This is another piece of economics humor. This is a real economics paper. One of the co-authors here, Doug Elmendorf, is the head of the Congressional Budget Office. This paper is called Can Financial Innovation Help to Explain the Reduced Volatility of Economic Activity? A paper that was published in 2006, shortly before financial innovation led to the greatest increase in the volatility of economic activity since the Great Depression. You may think this bodes ill for the research that was done by these scholars, but in fact, it's okay. I have tracked down the abstract of this paper, and here's the abstract of the paper. No. No, it can't. Again, that's how to get a hold of me. If you've got a business card, you want to be on my email list, again, I'd love to collect your business card. I won't spam you, but I'll let you know when I have new videos or when I have shows coming up. And like I mentioned, every year I run the humor session at the American Economic Association meeting, and you are all invited. Yes, and if you're interested in economics, I encourage you to come to the whole meeting. It's kind of amazing. It's like 15,000 economists from all over the world who converge on one city for a long weekend, and it's wild. Maybe I'll finish with a couple of "you might be an economist if" jokes. So you might be an economist if you're an expert on money, but you dress like a flood victim. Case in point, I stole that one from an old Dilbert cartoon. You might be an economist if you think that America's next top model should be an endogenous growth model with technological change. You might be an economist if you don't read human interest stories because they don't interest you. You might be an economist if you've ever gone to a bank or other financial institution in the hopes of getting a date. If you plan to have your children born in December instead of January so that you can maximize the discounted present value of the child tax credit. You might be an economist if you think that supply and demand is a good answer to questions like, where do babies come from? And finally, you might be an economist if you adamantly refuse to sell your children because you think they'll be worth more later. Thank you all for coming out this morning. Hope it's been worth your while. Do you have any last words, Ryan? So you're done for the day. Thanks.